I'm just going to talk a little bit more about this relationship between mics in rooms. And there's probably no better example than using a drum kit recording to do that. So what I've got here is just an absolutely raw recording of a drum kit. There's been absolutely nothing done to it. So it's just what's come off the mics from a take. So we'll just look at it to begin with, and I'll introduce you to what's here. So it's a very simple drum mic setup, except there's a few unusual things about it. I do actually have 3 kick mics. I'll explain that. So essentially the kick-in mic is an Audix D6, and you'll see here that I put annotations on all my tracks, which is something that I always do, which indicates which mic I used and which preamp I used, and if there was any processing on the way in. But you can see here, this is just a recording with a bunch of mics going straight into preamps, going straight into Pro Tools. So there's no EQ, there's nothing going on here at all apart from the mic attached to a preamp. So the kick-in is an Audix D6 going into an API preamp. There's 2 kick-out mics, and I'll just explain that. A friend of mine had just acquired a Stam Audio FET 47, which is like a classic clone of a Neumann mic, the Neumann FET 47. And we have at Macquarie the Bock FET 47, which is David Bock, an American maker's clone of it as well. And so we just put the 2 mics in exactly the same position, just out of interest to see whether there was any difference in the sound between the 2, just to understand, just to hear that firsthand. Then there's a snare top mic, which is an SM57 that's going into a Chandler TG1 preamp. And you'll see here also a second snare top mic, a AKG 451, which is a condenser. So we've got a Shure Dynamic and an AKG condenser. This is something that I do. Sometimes I will just tape them together so that they're absolutely coincident. There's no time delay between them. Again, there are tonal characteristics between the condenser microphone and the dynamic microphone that you will hear when we start to solo the channels. But being coincident, it means that if I wanted to, I could use a blend of the 2 mics. There's a snare bottom mic, which is recorded with a Shure SM57 going into an API preamp. It's customary, and I'll talk about this later, when you set up the snare bottom mic, that you invert the polarity at the preamp on that, because typically they wind up out of phase just because of the distance to the top mic. And so a standard maneuver when you're recording a drum kit on that bottom mic is to invert the polarity using the polarity switch on the preamp, and then it brings it back into phase. There's a hi-hat mic, which is an AKG 451 condenser going into an API preamp. There are 2 toms, so 1 rack and 1 floor, which are mic'd up with Sennheiser 421 dynamics, and this one's going into an API preamp, and the floor is going into a Chandler germanium preamp. In the overhead area, I'm using ribbons, which are by nature bidirectional, but I've placed them in a coincident pattern, which means that they are in an XY relationship with the capsules together, pointing in different directions across the kit. It's not actually technically an XY arrangement, because when you put bidirectional microphones as opposed to cardioids in that pattern, you call that a Bloomline pair. So those microphones are not only picking up what's in front of the microphones, they're picking up reflection from behind the microphones as well. So there's a pair of ribbons as overheads, the Royers, going into JLM preamps. And then there are 2 room microphones, which I placed right at the room boundaries of our live room in Recording Studio 1. And they are Audio-Technica 4050s, and they are a multi-pattern condenser. So I switched them to omnidirectional because the purpose of these microphones is just to pick up room reflection. Okay, so that is how many mics? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 mics on the drum kit. So because there's 13 mics, then obviously there's the potential for some phase differences between the 2. So we'll look at that first, but before I do that, I'll just play you a little bit of the drum recording just so you can hear it first, just in its raw form. toms are not really hit much, they only hit a few times, somewhere down here. Okay, so you get the idea. Pretty simple pattern, just the raw recording of the drums. I would normally start out first when I'm looking at this take by just looking at the phase relationships between the microphone. And normally I would start with the snare drum, because typically, you know, when something's out of phase with the snare, it really interferes with the drum sound, because the snare is such a central part of any drum sound. So what I would normally do is just pick a snare. Might just put this up on medium. So there's a big snare there, right? And I would zoom in. Okay. Now, you can see here, what's interesting is that these two mics are the two snare top mics, which is the Shure SM57 and the AKG 451 condenser. And as I said, I taped them together so that they were perfectly coincident on that top mic. So you can see there's absolutely no time delay between those two mics, and they are perfectly in phase. Then the snare bottom mic, you'll see here, because I inverted the polarity on it, it is also in phase, okay, with the snare top mics. So, you know, it's going up on its positive trajectory on the waveform in line with the top mics, and down and so on. Okay, so I've got no phase problems there. Interestingly, if we just zoom in a little bit further again, not too far, you will see there's a kind of a slight delay between the snare going into the snare mics and also it hitting the hi-hat mic. But, you know, when we look at the phase relationship here, it's still within the kind of ballpark. It's not moving in opposite directions, so we're not going to get too much phase cancellation from that hi-hat microphone being open and picking up snare. Where you probably would see more time delays is you look further down here, you start to see delays opening up here, and particularly with the overheads. Now, in order to kind of investigate that, the best way to do it, or the way I do it, is I just take one of my snare top mics and I drag it down so that it's above the overheads. That lets me see the time relationship very well, and you can see there is a time difference between that snare close mic and the snare arriving into the overheads here. And what's interesting about that is that you can see also that it's out of phase, right? So when the snare is going into its downward trajectory on the waveform, pretty close to it, the overheads, it's going in its upward trajectory. So that time difference there is going to cause some phase interaction. So if I just play it, I might take the room mics out just for a moment, just so we can hear a little bit more accurately. I might maybe just take the spill out from the racks as well, and maybe the hi-hat, just so we can hear it really clearly. Okay, that doesn't sound bad. Okay, I mean, phase differences may not sound bad. I mean, it sounds like okay, the snare sounds all right. But my guess is that there will be some differences if we were to bring the alignment of the phase of the overheads in with the snare mic. So let's do that now and just see. I'll just use the grabber tool here, and I'm just going to get my overheads and slip them in time here so that they're lining up more accurately with the snare mic. Okay, let's just give that a whirl. Now you'll need headphones for this, but that did bring in some more low end, or some low mids at least, on the snare. So I'll just undo that and then redo it. Okay, there's a difference there in low end. Okay, so I'll just compare that now. So here's in phase, out of phase. So you can hear a real difference there in the amount of low mids or kind of beef in the snare. And that's kind of interesting. Changing the time difference between these microphones does alter the tone of the snare. And that's really typical, where you get the time difference between the snare and the overheads affecting the sound of the snare. So this is something you can pay attention to. I'm going to leave it lined up because it puts a little bit more body into the snare. It doesn't really change the high end all of that much. Okay, it just gives it a bit more body, a bit more of the shell of the drum when it's lined up. Okay, so that's a really good example of these phase relationships and the way that they do actually affect the sound of what's going on when you've got a multi-mic arrangement. Okay, so we checked phase and we lined up things so that we improved the phase relationships between the microphones. And now I just want to have a quick run through the mics before we do anything else. Let's have a listen to them. So kick in. Classic kick in sound. Inside the drum itself. Okay, kick out just in front of the outside drum head. This is the Bach 47. Obviously you hear a bit more spill because it's actually outside the drum head. The stam. Notice the tonal difference. The stam has a little more mid-range in it. So these are two different manufacturers who've made a clone of a Neumann FET 47. So yeah, there are some slight differences in those two mics. So that was interesting for me to hear. Okay, snare top mic. I better move my snare top back over. The 57. And then the 451. Different sound. You hear that, listen to the hi-hat. You can really hear that there's more higher end on the condenser, which is what we would expect from what we know about the differences between dynamics and condensers. The SM57 has a little bit more beef from proximity. Has a little bit more ring in it as well, so that's quite interesting. Anyway, I've got both of those mics. Snare bottom. Just the rattle of the snares, and then the hi-hat. You get the idea that there's a lot of spill between mics in a drum kit. Okay, the toms. Let's just have a quick look at those, where they actually get played. Okay, so close mic perspective on toms, and I think they may have had T-tails on them because they've got very short delays. Overheads. Okay, and then rooms. Okay, we're really hearing the room there, which is the idea. Okay, and then everything together. Take the rooms out. Take the overheads out. So notice how everything gets a lot more direct when the rooms are out and when the overheads are out, which is unsurprising given that it's bringing us into our close mic perspective. More on that later. So let's go back to our edit window. So I'll do what I normally do when I'm just preparing a drum take. Normally I will kill the rack and the floor if there's nothing happening, because really all they're contributing when they're not happening is spill. Okay, so that's the rack and the floor. So that's just feeding bleed into the sound. So I would normally just close down these mics or get rid of this stuff where these mics are not actually active. So I can see that's where my rack first gets hit. I'll just do it roughly first and then I'll tune it later. And I can see this is where my rack and floor get hit. And then, okay, so let's just zoom in, do that a little bit more accurately. Well, on this one, there is no floor at all, so I can just kill the floor there. And I can go in and just put a little crossfade on this, Command F. The amount of decay you leave, you know, it's just fading into the spill. So I can just guess that. Now it sounds like it disappears, right? But if I have it with the overheads there, you know, you don't notice it. Let me turn those rooms down because they're just a bit full on. So you know, you don't notice that once in the context when the overheads and stuff are open. So let's do the same here. Let's do that roughly first. Solo my rack. Command F for a fade. Command F, solo it. That one goes away really quickly. It had a T-tail on it. Ringo style. Maybe that's a bit too much. Command F. Okay, here I'm in context. Totally fine, right? Okay, so what that's done is it's just killed all of that bleed from the tom mics just being open when the drummer is playing time. So that's just a series of first steps. We'll look at actually working these microphones now to shape the drum sound in various ways, because that's where we kind of get to see how we can really shape sounds by playing with the way we treat these microphones in post-processing or in post-production.